Hello, this is Tony Hiller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This video is titled, Always 10 Years Left to Save the Planet. The Washington Post is reporting today, the world has barely 10 years to get climate change under control, United Nations scientists say. Unless the Trump administration agrees to the Paris Accord, the whole world's going to fall apart. That's really scary. We better do something about this. But wait a minute. Here's the same story from 1989. That's almost 30 years ago. United Nations predicts disaster if global warming is not checked. A senior United Nations environmental official says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if the global warming trend is not reversed by the year 2000. If you remember back to the year 2000, the Y2K bug was also supposed to wipe us out that year. But I'm pretty sure we made it past the year 2000. Coastal flooding and crop failures would create an exodus of eco-refugees, threatening political chaos, said Noel Brown, director of the New York office of the UN Environment Program. He said governments have a 10-year window of opportunity to solve the greenhouse effect before it goes beyond human control. Climate experts seem to really like that 10-year number. They keep using it over and over again, every 10 years. As the warming melts polar ice caps, ocean levels will rise up to 3 feet, enough to cover the Maldives and other flat island nations, Brown told the Associated Press. We better check on the Maldives to see if they're okay. This is a live webcam showing what's going on there right now. Look at those people in terror running away from sea level rise. Conditions look really bad there. I might have to book a plane flight over there this winter to check out these terrifying conditions myself. Here's an article from the Canberra Times from almost exactly 30 years ago. Sea level is threatening to completely cover the Maldives' 1,196 islands within the next 30 years. Well, that's now. We just passed 30 years since this prediction was made, and they only missed by 1,196 islands. They're all still there. But even worse, the experts predicted that the Maldives would run out of water by 1992. But the end of the Maldives and its 200,000 people could come sooner if drinking water supplies dry up by 1992, as predicted. And who is making these predictions? The United Nations once again. So let's look at what's really going on in the Maldives. This is an article from the New York Times from last year. Inhabitants of Maldives atoll fear a flood of Saudi money. Not worried about a flood of water, they're worried about a flood of money. The leaders of Saudi Arabia are planning $10 billion investment. Why would the Saudis be investing $10 billion if the islands are going underwater? And here's an article from The Guardian last year. We need development. Maldives switches focus from climate threat to mass tourism. I don't think they'd be doing that if they were underwater like the UN predicted. And climate change doesn't really seem to be hurting their property values too much either. This villa in the Maldives costs more than 10 million pounds. We've seen some pretty bad predictions from climate scientists in the United Nations so far, but it gets worse. 10 years ago, NASA's leading climate scientist James Hansen said that President Obama only had 4 years left to save the Earth. Barack Obama has only 4 years to save the world. That is the stark assessment of NASA scientist and leading climate expert Jim Hansen, who last week warned only urgent action by the new president could halt the devastating climate change that now threatens Earth. Crucially, that action will have to be taken during Obama's first administration, he added. So there you have it. The world's leading climate experts said we ran out of time 5 years ago. And here's another one from last year from the World Economic Forum. These experts say we only have 3 years to save the planet from irreversible destruction. So this is getting a little confusing now. First they said we only had until the year 2000. Then they said we only had until the year 2013. Then last year they said we only had till the year 2020. And now they're saying we only have till the year 2028. So every time one of their predictions of calamity fails, they just keep pushing the date back. They've been doing this for decades. Now let's go back further to 1972. 42 top American and European investigators wrote a letter to President Nixon warning him of a new ice age. They told the president, the present rate of the cooling seems fast enough to bring glacial temperatures in about a century. Wow, we better do something to stop this ice age. And here's another one from The Guardian from 1974. The threat of a new ice age must now stand alongside nuclear war as a likely source of wholesale death and misery for mankind. We better stop that ice age. And satellites confirmed it. January 29th, 1974. Space satellites show new ice age coming fast. Worldwide and rapid trend towards a mini ice age are emerging from the first long-term analyses of satellite weather records. And here's the cover of Science News from March 1st, 1975. The Ice Age cometh. New York City getting wiped out by glaciers. That's pretty scary. And 40 years ago, the New York Times said, an international team of specialists has concluded from 8 indexes of climate there's no end in sight to the cooling trend of the last 30 years. And here's another article from Newsweek from 1975. There are ominous signs that the Earth's weather patterns have begun to change dramatically, and these changes may portend a drastic decline in food production, with serious political implications for just about every nation on Earth. Wow, we're going to starve to death. The evidence in support of these predictions has now begun to accumulate so massively that meteorologists are hard-pressed to keep up with it. Climatologists are pessimistic that political leaders will take any positive action to compensate for the climatic change or even allay its effects. The scientists wanted the government to do something about this global cooling, and they proposed melting the polar ice caps by covering it with soot. That'll stop that global cooling. And here's a graph from the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder. They showed temperatures plummeting after the 1940s. And here's another article from the top 2 climate researchers at NCAR, Stephen Schneider and Walter Orr Roberts. Observers of the global climate at the National Center for Atmospheric Research believe the favorable weather of the past 15 years is about to give way to a period of unstable climate, crop losses, food shortages, and death by starvation for millions. Underlying Schneider's ideas on food shortages is the knowledge that the world is moving into a period of cooler temperatures. Climate scientists, of course, don't want you to know about the ridiculous failed predictions from the past, so they just try to erase it. Here's an article from Scientific American in 2014 pretending that the global cooling scare never happened. Never mind the 42 scientists who wrote to President Nixon warning of a new ice age, or the 2 top scientists at NCAR, or all the satellites, or all the other stories. Now they say it was only 9 paragraphs in Newsweek was their entire scam. It's always amazing to me that formerly respectable publications like Scientific American think they can get away with lying like this. This kind of information is pretty easy to look up on the internet these days. And you remember that graph from NCAR I showed you earlier showing how temperatures dropped off dramatically after the 1940s? Well, NASA simply erased that. So let's go back a little further before the 1970s global cooling scare. Let's go back to the 1950s global warming scare. February 18th, 1952, melting ice caps mystery. Dr. William S. Carlson, an Arctic expert, said last night the polar ice caps were melting at an astonishing and unexplained rate and threatened to swamp seaports by raising ocean levels. The glaciers of Norway and Alaska, he said, are only half the size they were 50 years ago. So before we had the global warming scare, we had the global cooling scare. And before we had the global cooling scare, we had another global warming scare. It's almost like the climate is cyclical. Let's look at that a little closer and go back to 1939. Glaciers melting over Greenland. All the glaciers in eastern Greenland are rapidly melting. It may without exaggeration be said that these glaciers, like those in Norway, face the possibility of catastrophic collapse. Wow, that was 1939. Your SUV's been doing a lot of damage for a long time. The scientist who reported this was Professor Hans Ullmann, who was the leading expert on the Arctic at the time. Now let's fast forward to another prediction from Jim Hansen in 1988, the world's leading climate scientist from NASA. Jim Hansen, the scientist who in 1988 predicted the greenhouse effect for Congress. I went over to the window with him and looked out on Broadway in New York City and said, If what you're saying about the greenhouse effect is true, is anything going to look different down there in 20 years? Hansen said, yes, the West Side Highway, which runs along the Hudson River, will be underwater. You'll have signs in restaurants saying water by request only because of the drought. And when did he say this will happen? Within 20 or 30 years. And remember, we had this conversation in 1988 or 1989. So that's now. Lower Manhattan's supposed to be underwater already. I think he might have missed that prediction by a little bit. Does he still believe these things? Yes, he still believes everything. I talked to him a few months ago and he said he wouldn't change anything that he said then. So apparently he believes that Lower Manhattan's underwater right now. Here's another prediction by Hansen from 2008. NASA scientists, we're toast. Hansen, echoing work by other scientists, said that in 5 to 10 years the Arctic will be free of ice in the summer. And Representative Ed Markey, Democrat from Massachusetts, committee chairman, said, Dr. Hansen was right. 20 years later we recognize him as a climate prophet. Maybe if the Democrats win the election this fall, they can make James Hansen the official climate prophet of the United States. Let's see how Dr. Hansen's 2008 forecast fared. He said the Arctic was going to be ice-free no later than this year. This is the latest sea ice thickness map from the Danish Meteorological Institute, dated October 7th, 2018. They show there's a lot of really thick ice in the Arctic, from 2 to 5 meters thick. I don't really think that's ice-free like Dr. Hansen predicted. But I guess it's good enough for him to be a Democratic Party climate prophet. So what can we do to stop all this global warming and global cooling and global warming? Well, the New York Times is lamenting that we had a chance to stop all this climate change 30 years ago. 30 years ago, we had a chance to save the planet. The science of climate change was settled. The world was ready to act. So that was back around 1988. So the New York Times says that global warming was settled science back in 1988, and we could have stopped it except for those evil Republicans. Except let's go back and look at what the New York Times was actually saying back then. New York Times, January 26, 1989. U.S. data since 1895 failed to show warming trend. After examining climate data extending back nearly 100 years, a team of government scientists has concluded that there's been no significant change in average temperatures or rainfall in the United States over that entire period. So global warming science was settled, except that there wasn't actually any global warming going on back then. And just a few years earlier, the New York Times was pimping global cooling, not global warming. Not exactly settled science, as the New York Times claims now. The important thing to realize when you're reading the New York Times is that they simply make many of their articles up. There's no data backing up these claims that they're making. Just some author saying something that's politically correct and hoping that the reader's too dumb to actually check the facts. This is my favorite climate change article, though, from January 10th, 1871 in the Brisbane Courier. Imaginary Changes of Climate. A plentiful crop of speculation from weather prophets and projectors and half-instructed meteorologists and all the philosophic tribe of Laputa in general, to whom the periodical press now affords such fatal facilities. Every season is sure to be extraordinary, almost every month one of the driest or wettest or windiest, coldest or hottest ever known. Much observation which ought to correct a tendency to exaggerate seems in some minds to have a rather tendency to increase it. The key elements of the story for me are that people have always been imagining climate change, the press always picks up on it, and that experts always exaggerate everything. So basically nothing has changed since 1871. People are still people, and they're still making up complete garbage about climate change. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.